Welcome to the Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at North Kentucky University. With me today is my regular co-host, Cleveland area attorney and Republican factotum, Jay Carson.
Happy New Year, Mike.
Yeah, Happy New Year to you too. How are you doing?
I'm pretty well. It's a little weird because it's not exactly the New Year yet.
That's true. No, almost, but
we don't know how a lot of bowl games have turned out and that sort of stuff. So
it will be.
I might actually, by the time people hear this, I might feel differently than I feel now. But
yes, and hopefully by the time people hear this, I will feel differently because I am still struggling under this sort of upper respiratory tract thing. So with any luck, I will keep the hacking and wet coughing to a minimum. So we'll see how it goes. But I have high hopes. Anyway, so if you're ready, Jay, we can just kind of plunge right in.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I wanted to start from a comment from our last listener mail show, and this is from Eric, who sent us a link to a Miami Herald article that he thought that you, Jay, might have been referencing when you were discussing vote fraud, specifically ballots that have been found, that allegedly had been found in an airport rental car. And Eric wrote, "You will note that the article is titled, 'No, those ballot boxes found in Broward don't contain votes,' officials say," and was published a full 7 days before Jay went on to cite it or another article to push his right-wing agenda. Please issue a retraction or cite the mysterious article published right before you went to air from the same newspaper that apparently said the complete opposite." So, Jay, when we mentioned that last time, you hadn't had a chance to read the article, and obviously it made sense not to respond until you'd had a chance to do that. So, having looked at that now, what do you think?
I've looked at it and I stand by my story. I stand by their stories, actually. The article I referred to, and this is what I talked about when we were on the show, spoke about ballots being found in the back of a rental car in the Florida airport, all of which is true. The difference this article makes, which Eric points out, and again, I'd say thank you, Eric, for keeping an eye on me, for keeping us honest here. But this was a response from the Broward County elections lawyers saying, well, there were no votes found in the boxes, which is true. And it's not something that I alleged. I said there were ballots. The difference being votes are ballots that have been filled out. In the article that Eric had sent, the attorney for Broward County Board of Elections and for Brenda Snopes says, no. What was found in those boxes was merely, and this is one of the beautiful euphemisms, it was voting supplies, if you will, which included, and then sort of if you dig deeper, well, there were some pencils, there were some pens, but and there were some provisional ballots. And note that the box that was found in this car was marked provisional ballots. And the Broward County response was, well, we mark a lot of boxes, a lot of things, and it's all just it's voting supplies, really. So no, I look, Eric, I appreciate it if I was unclear as the difference as to whether actual filled out votes were found in the back of this car or whether it was just provisional ballots. Let me clarify that I was talking about provisional ballots, which is this is supported by that story. And I stand by my concern that if you just have provisional ballots floating around in the back of rental cars, that's an indication that your system is either so unsecure that it invites fraud, or it's an indication that something improper is going on. So either way, I stand by it. I don't think you ought to have. There ought to be a clear chain of custody for official provisional ballots, so that you can avoid things like the vote harvesting type scandals that we've seen elsewhere, where you can just have ballots that would show up out of nowhere brought in by someone. So, Eric, again, I appreciate the.
Okay, so yeah, actually,
I appreciate Eric's vigilance.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, it was not a part of me to try to steer my right-wing agenda.
Gotcha. I was actually unclear on that too. So maybe I was drifting off as you were explaining it the first time. But sometimes that happens,
Yeah.
But I
Go
actually
back and listen
thought
to the tape. Yeah.
along the same lines as Eric that you were alleging that actual filled out ballots were found in the trunk, and so that's obviously a pretty important distinction. And so I certainly understand your concern. We wouldn't want voting supplies just kind of floating around. But I would also say it's one thing to, and I think what a lot of folks have done is assume that, well, that, it's actually that there were completed votes that were not being counted that were in this, and that's a whole different thing.
Well, no, and actually, really, the concern from conservatives obviously wasn't that there are completed votes that weren't being counted. It's that there were votes that were being created.
Right.
Right. That was the concern, is that these just okay, you've got the people who actually vote, and then you've got the additional ballots that were just seeming to show up in the middle of the night, and that was the conservatives' concern. So,
and yet, ironically,
well, not to be everyone's concern, really.
Ironically, in the only sort of fairly well documented, widespread vote fraud case in this recent election, it's actually just the opposite, with seemingly conservatives harvesting absentee votes and not turning them in. And that's, of course, the North Carolina situation, where it looks like the House is not going to seat Harris, I believe, who ostensibly won that election. So that's still an ongoing type of thing.
Right.
But anyway. All right. Let's see.
And I'm against that too, Eric. So.
Yes, you're against vote fraud in general, right? I mean, I think it's fair to say. So a different Eric wrote in, who he recently became a sustaining supporter of the show on Patreon not too long ago, and he said, "Hi, Politics Guys. I became a patron after hearing Mike say how grateful he was to reach $500 in monthly donations, which shocked me because a show of this quality deserves so much more." Well, absolutely, Eric. First off, you're totally right. I figure an order of magnitude more would be a good start, but we're working on it. Anyway, so he writes, "My political views align mostly with Mike, a wise man. Hearing my own opinions elegantly put to voice over a podcast is nice. Well, that's nice. That's flattering. But I enjoy listening to Jay even more because he helps me see today's conservative perspective. So if I may make one criticism, often when Mike and Jay disagree, Mike has a habit of ending the conversation with, 'Well, you're wrong.'" Well, yeah, I do that. I understand the need to move conversation forward, but I do not believe knocking down the opposing opinion that way should appear on a show dedicated to civil debate so often. But feel free to tell me that I'm wrong. The show is one of a kind. Keep it up. I definitely do that. And I think, Jay, this is, I imagine, the spirit in which you take it, is that it's sort of in a joking, sort of a, not like a kind of a, Jane, you ignorant slut sort of thing. That's a reference from our...
Well, I sort of do take it from Jane, you
But yeah, exactly. It's sort of a comedic sort of way of, at some point, Eric, as you realize, we sort of need to move on to the next thing. And there are some points at which I don't know.
That's Mike's way of saying we agree to disagree.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think because we have some fundamental premises that we disagree on, those aren't going to change. And since we're working from different premises, we can't really get past a certain point. And at that point, it just makes sense to sort of move on. And so maybe
or we can't get past a certain point on that, whatever certain topic it is, based on the information that's there or the issue that's, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And, I believe that
there are lots of times where things are, well, we'll wait and see how this turns out. And, but yeah.
Definitely. So, I mean, I firmly believe that, Jay being a smart and well-intentioned person, that given enough time, I could win him over to the way of goodness and truth. But, we just don't have that kind of time here on the show.
Right.
So I'm sure Jay believes the same thing. So anyway, thanks so much, Eric. Next, we have Don, who writes, "As always, I love the show, and I believe it's getting even better. Great job.
Wow.
But here I am again about term limits. I just can't quit thinking about them as a solution to this partisan win-at-all-cost mentality in Congress that just continues to plague us. I emailed you before, and you and Jay were good enough to discuss my question on the podcast. Both of you focused on how term limits would not achieve a desired end of making sure there were changing faces in Congress and gave good reasons for why. I agreed with your reasoning, but you both missed my main point, which I want to bring up here again. Whoops. Okay. Anyway, he says, my support of term limits isn't about making sure there are changing faces in Congress, but rather I see them as a weapon against this constant malady of gutlessness among elected officials because they're always concerned with winning over the party, or they're always concerned about getting reelected, or both. And both things almost always lead to partisanship and gridlock. To me, the teeth of term limits is that they would cut out some of the first thing and at least the second thing altogether. Here's why I bring it up again. Recently, Jay was commenting on lame duck legislatures operating within lame duck sessions, and he said, tough choices are made in lame duck sessions. Exactly. I believe he made my point. Wouldn't term limits create a lot of ducks with guts making tough choices? So, Jay, what do you think?
That's an interesting take. I guess the way I would look at it is there's a difference between being a lame duck, meaning, look, you have been a lame duck in the sort of the truest sense of that, in that you have been defeated, right? Not that you are just moving on to a different office. Then sort of having nothing to lose to go ahead and vote your conscience. Again, the term limits, based on my experience of them at the state level, it doesn't move the needle on partisanship or giving people more latitude. It's much the other, in that you've got folks who are, because they're going to be essentially out of work, right? In whatever, 4 years, 6 years, 8 years, whatever the term limit is, that they are necessarily angling for the next job. That may be another office that they're running for. It may be much more likely some sort of appointment somewhere, and that gives that changes the balance of power. It gives more power to the executive in terms of making appointments. It gives more power to, now again, appointments are a little bit different in the federal level than the state level. But there's also more of them to be made, right? There's always a place to find to put somebody if you need it. And I think that's sort of a, I don't want to say corruption, because it's not corrupt. It's just politics. But it doesn't in my view change the way the system operates. It tilts it a little bit more towards the executive, or it tilts a little bit more towards party leadership, who would be active in deciding who's going to get support to run for that other office. For example, whether it's a Senate seat or a state governorship or wherever your guy with the clock running on him is going to go. So.
Yeah. And I would agree with all that. The one thing I would add is it also, I think, you need to think in terms of the incentives of these office holders, and certainly they might be going on to another position and want the party support or hope to get an appointment. The other thing, and this is the most popular, the most common job for ex-members of Congress, is to be a lobbyist. And so
right.
If their incentives are to do what the lobbyists who might be their future employers are, that's not going to necessarily change their conduct a whole heck of a lot. And so I agree with you. I'd add that. The other thing I'd add is I just generally have a problem with term limits because it puts a constraint on the voters to choose the person that they want to choose. And so if we're going to constrain voters that way, we better have a really good reason for doing that. And the evidence to me just doesn't support that. All right. Moving on. Let's see. Eric, this is maybe our third Eric of the day. I don't know. It's the week of Erics. But there you go.
The same guy, just messing with me.
But anyway, Eric left his comment on the website in the comments section, publicskies.com. He writes, "Hey guys, I'm a Florida Democrat who also happens to be a citizen of Ecuador, where mandatory voting is the law. I can't believe it, but I agree with Jay. I know the feeling. Sometimes it happens to me, Eric. It's weird. Anyway, the practical effect of mandatory voting is to flood voting places with people who wish to avoid the $40 fine and are the least informed or interested in politics. The wealthy and educated, the most politically active class in the U.S., largely eschews voting in Ecuador because they rightly conclude their pro-business views will be drowned out by leftist appeals to the bottom third of the income distribution. The only
I don't like
people
the sound of that.
the only people that cannot afford to pay the fine for not voting. Great show. Well, thank you, Eric. Now, I'm not an Ecuador expert, obviously. Jay, I'm guessing you're not either. But
No, I'm not.
But I will say this. I went looking for some some voting statistics by demographics and, like exit polls, that sort of
Right.
thing. I couldn't find anything. And so as a social scientist, I'm not saying, Eric, that you're wrong about this, but I'm not ready to say you're right about it unless I can find some data to support that. So maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong. But what I will point out is in the last Ecuadorian presidential election, and this was in 2017, it was a pretty closely fought thing between the right wing and the left wing candidate. The winner got 51.16% to 48.84%. So it's not like the votes of the business class are necessarily being, at least based on that, being washed away in any sense. And I'll also point out that Ecuador's voter turnout, as you would expect, is considerably higher than it is, say, in the United States. They average around 80% or so, where in the U.S. for presidential elections, we're around mid-60s, and then for midterms, we tend to be somewhere in the mid-40s or so. And so I'm not disagreeing, but I would need some data to demonstrate that. And even if that data exists, I would say, well, I don't necessarily know.
Wouldn't believe you.
Well, no, I might believe you, but I might say, well, is that necessarily, we need to talk about exactly what that means and if it's a good or a bad thing. And if the wealthy can't be bothered to vote, well, then that sounds like the wealthy's problem, in a sense. And so there's a lot going on here, but I think to start with, I need to find some data, and maybe it's out there, but my guess is that there's probably not a ton of good exit polling data in Ecuador. Maybe there is, and maybe I'm wrong. And if there is, if anyone knows about it, I couldn't find it, send it my way. I'd be happy to revisit this. Jay, any thoughts?
Oh, I think it's interesting because that's something that actually didn't occur to me, was the idea of people who wouldn't vote would be the ones who could afford to pay the fine.
But I would say that might actually be a good thing because, the people who tend to have the most, who tend to vote the least are the people who are in lower socioeconomic classes. And so if they can be encouraged by various ways to vote more, then that makes the voting population look more like the public in general, and other things being equal should give you a more representative result.
Right, but you just said, well, if the rich can't be bothered to vote, well, then that's a problem for the rich. I mean, couldn't the same be said, well, if the poor can't be bothered to vote, well, that's their problem?
Except that the poor have certain structural barriers to voting that the rich don't have. Like being poor, Generally speaking, being poor, no, I'm serious. Generally speaking, being poor makes everything harder, including voting. We can't just laugh that off. I'm not that you're twirling your mustache and so forth, that kind of thing, and cackling or anything. But I'm saying that's a very real truth, and it's true about voting.
No, what I'm laughing at is if the problem is that the poor have barriers to voting. How does fining them $40 help remove those barriers?
No, I'm saying you're right. And it doesn't help to remove the barriers.
Counterintuitive.
Yeah, no, and it doesn't help to remove the barriers, and that's a fair point. But I think for a lot of folks, it's just a matter, and it puts one more thing on them, and I'm not. And
also, my sense is $40 is probably a lot more money to a poor person in Ecuador than it is to someone here. Also, I think
I would expect
that I don't know the economic exchange rate or anything like that, but my sense is that's not an insubstantial fine, right?
I would guess not, but I mean, again, not being an Ecuador expert, or even close to an expert, I wouldn't want to speculate, but in general, again, I would like to see a system that would remove a lot of these barriers and, help people to vote in that way, as opposed to fining them or anything like that. In different countries with mandatory voting do it different ways, certainly. Like, I don't know how aggressively this fine is pursued. I know in some countries, for instance, there's a fine, but it's not something that there are fines for jaywalking and things like that aren't necessarily very, that aren't necessarily carried out. You won't see, like in major American cities, a lot of people being fined for jaywalking, even though technically they could be. I don't know if that's the case with voting or not. So in mandatory voting countries or in Ecuador. But anyway, any other thoughts on that, Jay?
No, not
Okay.
well. Other than just again, I stand by sort of the general basis that, look, just because something may be good for you personally, not you personally, Mike, but for a person to do, or good for society, typically the way the West has always operated is it's sort of this system of logical positivism. Positivism that, look, you can you start with the assumption that you're free to do what you want to do, and then here's the exceptions where here's the bad stuff that you can't do because it's harmful to everybody, but we don't tend to legislate and here's good stuff that you must do, because that can grow to be an incredibly long list.
Yeah, and I think that's a fundamentally broken assumption and a bad one. But then again, in the last few months, I've just grown to question more and more the whole liberalism enlightenment project, and that's a whole nother story. So anyway, for another day. But yeah, so I disagree with you on such a deep level that we need to do probably a whole series on that. But anyway,
Okay.
There's another view on mandatory voting we got also this week from Brian from Australia, who recently also posted in politicsguys.com in a comment section. And let's see, you might recall, Jay, I cited Australia as an example of possibly how mandatory voting could be done in the United States. And Brian thought it would be a good idea if we had some first-person details, since him being from Australia. He writes, as I'm an Australian citizen, I thought I should weigh in, as I think there is a fundamental misunderstanding about mandatory voting that often derails discussions such as yours in an unhelpful way. Firstly, and most importantly, our law does not force us to vote. And I mean that in a very literal way. The Australian law requires that on election day, you turn up to a voting center or mail in your papers ahead of time if you've made those arrangements and have your name ticked off on a voting register. That is your entire requirement. From that point, when you're handed your voting sheets, you can fill them in or, if you wish, or drop the form uncompleted in the box. No one checks whether you filled anything out. No one stands over you as you write your preferences. Whatever you do, once you're handed those voting papers, is entirely your freedom of choice. As I said, you are not in any real sense forced to vote. You are just compelled to be aware of the political process of which you play an instrumental part, whether by your action or no. It sounds like a semantic difference, but I assure you it is profound in the impact it creates. Firstly, you not only have a more representative result, as it encourages people to pay attention to the issues and the promises of each respective party in the lead up to their social responsibility, but it places the requirement of providing sufficient facilities for voting upon the government. It's also why our election days are on holidays, so no one is disincentivized to participate. Our system may not be perfect, but there's a reason you do not hear as many stories about voter disenfranchisement and vote suppression here, because that right to vote is sacred and must not be impinged by political chicanery. Meanwhile, I was sadly unsurprised by the deft way that Jay pivoted from a promise to look into the misinformation he's been spreading for the past few weeks about election fraud to a full-throttle repeat of some said conspiracy rambling. I'll look into it and get back to you, but blah, 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 so forth and so on. And you actually addressed this earlier. So anyway,
I did. I got back to you. And my delay in getting back had more to do with really our schedule, our recording schedule, than it wasn't. I was
so on the second part, we can
hiding from Eric or
Brian or anyone else. Yeah, absolutely. So
yes.
So I hope that that for the second part, and Brian went on as well, but. Jay, I think you answered that, your response. That was pretty, I think, clear. But I really appreciated the the information on Australia's more detail on their system. And I think that brings up a good point, is that, like with so many of these things, the devil, if you will, is in the details. And there are a lot of ways to design a mandatory voting system where, and it's not necessarily, and I would say shouldn't be, frog marching people to the polls, basically, right? That would be a really bad idea.
That Australian version sounds much less onerous than the Ecuadorian version.
Yeah, I mean, I
don't know all the specifics of Ecuador either, but actually, this was one of the questions I had on mandatory voting is, does that mean you have to vote for every office, and how does that work?
Right.
For example, there are, in most cities, certainly in mine, you'll have a judges, 3 pages worth of judges, all of them named Gallagher or O'Connor, and it's sorting through them. And this is, look, I'm somebody who works in that system. Sorting through them can be difficult, and a lot of times people say, no, I'm just not going to weigh in on something I don't know about. I think that's.
And Australia, I should point out that their voter turnout is exceptionally high. They average in the mid 90% range, and they have for quite a long period of time, for as far back as I can see the stats, and that's back into the 40s actually, and that's pretty impressive. And it sounds like it's the sort of system that actually that actually allows for voters to participate or not, but it, based on what Brian tells us, that I like that idea, and certainly I think we should do what we can to incentivize voting and encourage voting, and things like making voting a holiday, or doing it on a holiday or a Saturday or something like that. I think those are all good ideas.
Okay.
Would you disagree with that? I mean,
no. I'm still going to disagree on the mandatory voting of just because, again, I have a fundamental issue with government says you have to go show up someplace or send something in, and they're keeping track of you whether you do it or not. I think that's problematic. But as far as other things, moving elections to a weekend or some other day, I don't see an issue with that, other than.
Well, let me ask you this, Jay. And I'm not being flip here. Do you think that citizens have any duties? Or is it all just about rights and no responsibilities? Because I'm trying to think about what, in your kind of more libertarianish view, are there any responsibilities? I mean, aside from not harming somebody else, do citizens have any positive responsibilities, or is it all just about, just don't hurt the other guy, do your own thing?
I'd say mostly it's about your duties are to follow the laws of where you live.
So it's all negative.
Don't do the other guy.
I mean that means it's all just
look.
That's really sad.
I'm not. No, I'm not saying not. Look, if we're talking about, but let's make a differentiation here about legal duties and moral duties, right?
Moral duties.
Pardon?
I said moral duties. Do we even believe in those anymore? I think your moral duty is to get as much stuff as you want and die with the most toys. That's what our culture wants us to do, right? I mean, come on.
That may be so, but look, I think there is a moral duty to participate in your community, in your government, and do so in an educated way. So yeah, absolutely. I think there's a moral duty, but I think there's a difference between that and having a legal duty compelling you to participate. Look, likewise, I would say there's sort of a moral duty, right, to kind of take care of yourself and so forth, but I don't think there's a legal duty, and I'd certainly balk at the government telling you got to go work out or something, right? I mean, again, there's people need it's sort of like, and again, we're getting a little far afield, but this struck me the other day about this. It's like a Clockwork Orange, right? If you are compelled to do the right thing, are you really doing the right thing?
That's a reasonable.
Right?
Yeah, sure. I see what you're saying.
It's a bigger question
example,
than
but
for us.
Sure, absolutely,
Yeah.
It's kind of a philosophical sort of thing. So on that basis, then, would you be are you opposed then to people, registering for selective service as they're, required to do that sort of thing?
No,
Or
no, that's because to me that comes down to sort of a more fundamental. I think you could make the argument that a country needs to be able to defend itself, and that
no,
you ought to be,
yeah, I
you
agree.
know, ready and able to do that.
Yeah, I agree.
If whether people vote or not, I think is less fundamental.
See, I
Um,
would say that for a democracy, voting is even more fundamental to maintaining a democracy. But that's just me. So anyway, all right, let's see here. What do we got next? Oh yeah, okay, here we go. Sorry about that. Brian writes about the Michigan lame duck session. We talked a little bit about that actually, and he wrote in the
yeah.
Michigan.
Although we focus more on
Yeah,
Wisconsin, I think.
I think
But
we
yeah,
just mentioned Michigan in passing, basically. But he wrote, the true crime here, excuse the term, please, was the activity regarding minimum wage. The legislature quite literally stole a vote from the people of Michigan because the party in power feared the ballot proposal on minimum wage would pass. Then they destroyed the bill with a simple majority after the election. What does Jay have to say about this? And Jay, before you respond, I want to explain this to listeners, kind of a little bit of
sure.
the background. So the new law raises the state minimum wage in Michigan, and this is what the legislature passed, but it does so at a slower rate than was proposed through a ballot initiative that the Republican legislature removed from the ballot by approving it themselves, and then in the lame duck session, they rolled it back after the election, which, if I understand correctly, they wouldn't have been able to do had it been approved through the initiative. So they passed the
Right.
thing to make sure there wasn't an initiative, and then in the lame duck section, they rolled back the thing that they passed. And that seems like that certainly is sneaky, to say the least. That's the most
Yeah.
positive
Yeah.
spin. So what do you think about that, Jay?
Well, it certainly sounds sneaky to me. That said, I mean, I think your remedy is either now you've got a new majority where you can change that, or you put on a new initiative to mirror what the old initiative was.
Yeah, I mean,
Right. I think. Look, obviously, look, it's sneaky. I don't think it's illegal. And you've got a remedy there. So
I think, to me, and I talked about this the last time we talked about lame duck sessions, is the problem to me is when you have this, just all you go by is what's legal and what's not, as opposed to what is the, sort of the ethically right thing to do. We've talked about this before in the past. You can't you can't codify everything, every kind of right
yeah.
behavior, good behavior, bad behavior. There's this unwritten law, and it's true for conduct in general life. It's true for politics. And what we've seen more and more of is this idea that, well, we don't have to worry about the unwritten law. I can do whatever I want so long as it isn't illegal. And more as a society, I believe we're accepting this. And so you're right. There's a legal remedy. But the fact is that decent people wouldn't have done this because they know that it subverts the spirit of what representative democracy is supposed to be about. And it was a dirty, underhanded, unethical thing, but it absolutely was not illegal.
Well, let's take a look at it this way, because you and I have agreed a lot that initiatives, big voter, and again, this is as I understand the pure initiative, not a constitutional amendment, can be sort of a blunt instrument, right?
Absolutely.
That it necessarily lacks the sort of committee process, the vetting that you get when you go through the legislature. If you remember the legislature and you see this initiative coming forward, and you could say, look, this is obviously it's very democratic and small d democratic in terms of people are voting directly on it. But we see this as being a real problem, a real concern for the Michigan economy. We think this could cost, thousands, tens of thousands of jobs. Don't you have a moral responsibility to say, look, if we tweak this, we could make this something that would still have a minimum wage increase, but would not threaten sort of the economic livelihood of our state.
Sure. And so
Which again, is someone sitting here in Ohio, I'm like, all right, Michigan, you want to raise your minimum wage, go for it. But
Well, one would think
um,
that a decent person would do that by making their case through the initiative and not passing something to short circuit the initiative and then to roll it back. That's cowardly.
well, once the well, no,
Are you
that's not
so? Is
cowardly.
there
That's
anything? Let me ask you this, Jay. Is there anything that's legal that a legislature could do that you would say is wrong, or is it just if it's not legal,
Ooh.
if it's not illegal, then it's right? I mean, are you willing to make any sort of ethical judgment here, or are you just going to say legal or illegal?
Well, I guess here's my question: is why is it? I mean, I'm yeah probably sticking to the illegal or legal or illegal, and then the voters can make up their mind as far as the ethics of it, right? I mean, that's the way the system works.
I'm not
But
saying that's not how the
that's
system
that's the
works, but
cost you pay. That's where you evaluate that ethics component. There may be plenty of people in Michigan who would say, "Wow, that was really the right decision. Man, you saved our state. Thank you, guys." Um, uh,
so the ends would
but
justify the means.
the
Then
idea that you wouldn't use a legislative tool available to you to prevent something that you thought was a serious wrong, where the voters
yeah.
were I mean,
I
again,
get it. No, I
this
mean
was a
it's the
situation.
same
So
logic that people use to stick by Donald Trump, who's I think doing a lot to destroy.
no,
No,
it's
it is
not
it
the
is
same as
actually the
Donald
same
Trump.
logic, saying that we can get these good things, we can get a tax cut and so forth. So let's go along with this disgusting travesty of a human being as our president. I mean, I think that's exactly the same logic.
Well, keep in mind the people of Michigan, right, have the opportunity to voice their opinion on these folks, and a lot of people have been removed, and now they can fix it again. Again, I see a difference in working through a legislative process as opposed to Trumpian sort of the Trumpian kind of nonsense. As far as
And to me, it just sounds
I
like
don't know.
Machiavellian the end justifies the means kind of logic that I think is just so disastrous. But as to your point about the voters, correcting this, uh, that kind of leads right into the related point that Brian makes about gerrymandering. And he says, well, I absolutely agree it's a bipartisan problem, but we could argue which side currently has the most advantage. It's such a cop out to say that, well, if one side fixes it their way, then in 2 to 4 years, the other may get its chance to even it out. This is a false argument because most states redistrict every 10 years, not just every time the party in power switches. Michigan
Right,
is an
right.
excellent example where upwards of 54% of the state voted Democrat, yet the result of the midterms was a 53% Republican majority in the state House and a 58% Republican majority in the state Senate. As a result, redistricting, which will happen in 2020, would not have corrected the balance with the Republican legislature. Luckily, a ballot measure will hopefully ensure a bipartisan map so long as the legislature does not try to tamper with it. And that's the point I've made.
Well, there you go. I mean, that's
I mean, that's
right. I mean, they typically only redistrict 10 years, but that's at least in most states, and I don't know about Michigan in particular, is not a prohibition.
no,
Right? It's sort of you shall redistrict based on the census every 10 years, but I don't think there's a prohibition about doing it other times.
nope. In fact,
It probably
Republicans in
makes sense
Texas
to do
did
it.
it after the
Yeah.
2000, and they got into a lot of hot water because it was they seized the moment when they had a big majority, and I believe that was Tom DeLay, who was kind of at the time who was really the big guy behind that, and took a lot of flack. Again, something that I would say was not actually illegal, but was certainly unhanded, devious, and kind of going against the basic norms by which our democracy operates. I would argue, we've seen Republicans do that a lot more than Democrats.
I think you've got this again. This is a recent thing about the basic norms of democracy. I think you and I just have different views historically about what's how those norms have been observed or not observed.
Oh, well, no, I mean, historically, I think you go back a couple generations and see that Democrats were violating them a lot more. So I don't really see it. I mean, certainly if you look
Well,
at
that's what I'm saying. That's
voting
what
rights
my
in the
my thing
South.
is.
So
Are they norms? Are they? This is just what everyone has always done all the time.
I think they're absolutely. I mean, there are certain values that we have, and certainly we don't always honor them. but believing in one person, one vote, and the basic inequality of dignity of every human being in the political process and otherwise, they are absolutely bedrock values, and we never fully live up to them, but we don't just...
Customs more honored in their breach.
So you're saying that we shouldn't? I mean, of course you're not saying that, right?
No. I'm saying that's Shakespeare. I'm trying to class up the show here a little bit.
See, well, very, very impressive. I had not. That's you. Jay is by far the more cultured person of the two of us. There's no question whatsoever. I've known that for a long, long time. So thank you for that effort to inject a little bit of class into the show, which went totally over my head, as these things often do. So anyway, all right, that about does it for us for this kind of after our little break that we had for the new year. And of course, as expected, I don't know if anything would change by the time people hear this in a few days, but the government was shut down, so were we for a little while, and I don't expect that we're going to see much of a change.
No relation.
No, really. nothing like that or anything like that. So not at all. But anyway, so we hope you did enjoy this show, and if you're interested in supporting us, that would be great. You can do that through our Patreon site, patreon.com/politicsguys, or go to politicsguys.com/support. And if you're already a supporter, thank you very much. We'd really appreciate if you could share this show. Let your friends, neighbors, enemies, co-conspirators, what have you, indicted or otherwise, know about us. That would be great. And also, we have our Facebook page. It's facebook.com/politicsguys page. We're on Twitter @politicsguys. And if you want to get in touch with us to let us know what you think, we're at mail@politicsguys.com. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, Will Miller, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Saturday. We hope you'll join us.